Hello everyone. Let us now discuss distinguish between the following. Please write. Distinguish between the following. First, question number 1. Equity shares and preference shares. Equity shares and preference shares. First of all, points, equity shares, and preference shares. Let us make a table. Equity shares and preference shares. Let us see the first point, that is meaning. Meaning, equity shares means shares that are not preference shares, that are not preference shares are called as equity shares. Are called as equity shares. That is, these shares do not have the preferential rights for payment of dividends and repayment of capital. In preference shares are shares that carry preferential rights as to payment of payment of dividend and repayment of capital. Repayment of capital. Second point, rate of dividend. Rate of dividend. Equity shares are given dividend. Are given dividend at the fluctuating rate at fluctuating rate depending upon the profits of the company, the depending upon the profits of the company, depending upon the profits of the company. Preference shareholders. Preference shareholders. The preference shareholders do not enjoy normal voting rights. First right, preference shareholders get dividends at fixed rate. At fixed rate. Third point, voting rights. Voting rights. Equity shareholders enjoy normal voting rights they participate in the management of their company, in the management of their company, the preference shareholders do not enjoy normal voting rights. They can vote only on matters affecting their interest, their interest. Next point, return of capital. Return capital. return of capital, in that equity capital cannot be returned 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 during the lifetime of during the lifetime of the company during the lifetime of the company, except in case of buyback, except in case of buyback. A company can issue redeemable preference shares, redeemable preference shares, which can be repaid, which can be repaid during the lifetime of the company, during the lifetime of the company, during the lifetime of the company. Next point, let us first make the table. The next point is nature of capital. Next point is nature of capital. Equity capital is known as risk capital. Equity capital is known as risk capital, whereas preference capital is safe capital, is a safe capital with stable return, with stable return. Next point, Nature of investor. Nature of investor. In that, the investors who are ready to take risk. The investors who are ready to take risk. To invest in equity shares. And the investors who are cautious about the safety of their investment invest in preference shares. Invest in preference shares. Next, face value. Face value. In that, the face value of equity share is generally rupees 10 or 100 depending on the scenarios. It is relatively low. The face value of preference shares is relatively higher. That is rupees 100 and so on. Next point, right and bonus issue. Right and bonus issue. Equity shareholder is entitled to get bonus and right issue. To get bonus and right issue. Preference shareholders are not eligible for bonuses for bonuses and right issue. and right issue. Next point, capital appreciation. Capital appreciation in that the market value of equity shares the market value of equity shares increases with the prosperity of with the prosperity of the company. leads to it leads to an increase in the value of shares. The value of shares in preference shares, please write the market value of preference shares the market value of preference shares does not fluctuate so there is no possibility of capital appreciation. Next point, risk. Equity shares are subject to higher risk. Equity shares are subject to higher risk, whereas preference shares preference shares are subject to less risk. Next point, types. In that equity shares are classified into are classified into first, equity shares with normal voting rights. Another one, equity shares with differential voting rights. Preference shares are classified as cumulative preference shares. Cumulative preference shares. Non-cumulative preference shares. Third, convertible preference shares. Fourth, non-convertible preference shares. Fifth, redeemable preference shares. Sixth, irredeemable preference shares. Seventh, participating preference shares. Eighth, non-participating preference shares. Non-participating preference shares. Let us make the table. So this is your distinguish between equity shares and preference shares. In that we saw different points such as meaning, rate of dividend, voting rights, return on capital, nature of investor, face value, rights and bonus issues, capital appreciation, risk and its types. Let us move on to the next question, that is shares and debentures. Question number 2. Shares and debentures. Let us make the table. Shares and debentures. The presentation should be properly made First of all, first point, that is meaning. Points, shares, and debentures. The first point being meaning. In that, share is the smallest unit in the total share capital. Smallest unit in the total share capital. It is the smallest unit in the total share capital of the company. Of the company. It is also known as the ownership of securities. The ownership securities. Next, debenture is an instrument evidencing debt under the seal of company. Under the seal of company. They are also known as creditorship securities. Creditorship securities. Next, status. In that, a holder of a shares is the owner of the company. He is the owner of company. Hence, share capital is owned capital. Share capital is owned capital. A holder of debenture is the creditor of the company. Is the creditor of the company. Hence, the debenture capital is loan capital for borrowed capital. Borrowed capital. Third point, nature. Third point is nature. It is a permanent capital. It is permanent capital. It is not repaid during the lifetime of the company. It is not repaid during the lifetime of the company. It is a in debentures. It is a temporary capital. It is a temporary capital. Generally, it is repaid. Generally, it is repaid after a specific period. After a specific period. Next point, voting rights. Return on shares is called as dividend. Return on shares is called as dividend. Equity shareholders the equity shareholders receive dividends receive dividends at a fluctuating rate. At a fluctuating rate. Change this to return on investment. Return on investment. The return on shares is called as dividend. Equity shareholders receive dividends at fluctuating rates. At fluctuating rates. Whereas preference shareholders receive dividends at a fixed rate. At a fixed rate. In debentures, we would write return on debentures is called as interest. It is fixed It is fixed at the time of issue. At the time of issue. Interest is paid. Interest is paid even when a company has no profit. A company has no profit. Next point, voting rights. Voting or the rights. Shareholders being owners. Shareholders being owners enjoy normal voting rights. Enjoy normal voting rights. In general meetings and management of the company. In general meeting and they can participate they can participate they can participate in the management of the company. In the management of company. Debenture holders. Debenture holders being creditors. The debenture holders being creditors do not have sorry debenture holders being creditors do not have any voting rights and cannot participate in the management of the company. In the management of the company. Next point, security. In that, share capital is unsecured capital. Share capital is unsecured capital. No security is offered to shareholder. Debenture capital being loan capital is secured by is secured by creating a charge on company's profit. Sorry, on company's property. On company's property. Next point. Time of issue, in that shares are issued in the initial stages of company formation. Shares are issued in the initial stages of company formation. Debentures are issued at a later stage, when the company has properties to offer as a security. Next point. Suitability. Shares are suitable for long-term finance. Shares are suitable for long-term finance, whereas debentures are suitable for medium-term finance. Next point. Let us first make the diagram, the table. Medium term finance. Next point. Types. The shares are classified into equity shares and Preference shares. The shares are classified into equity shares and preference shares. A debenture is classified as registered debentures, bearer debentures, secured debentures, unsecured debentures, redeemable debentures, irredeemable debentures, convertible debentures, non-convertible debentures. Non-convertible debentures. Next point, which is position on liquidation. Position on liquidation of company. On liquidation of company, on liquidation of company, shareholders rank last in the list of claimants. Last in the list of that is the reason they are called as residual claimants. Next, debentures holders being creditors. Debenture holders being creditors rank prior to shareholders. Rank prior to shareholders for repayment of for repayment of for repayment on liquidation of company, on liquidation of the company, liquidation of the company. Now let us move on to the third question. These are the two questions. Please write the third question. First of all, let us make the table. there is some trouble. I think there is some lag between this software. Even you should make a table using proper pen, pencil and paper format. Do not write it as it is. Just delete this. Okay. Okay, so please give the heading owned capital and borrowed capital. Distinguish between owned capital and borrowed capital. Owned capital and borrowed capital. Let us write heading owned capital borrowed capital. In that, just bifurcate it in between points. Owned capital and borrowed capital. The first meaning, it is that capital which is contributed by shareholders, by the shareholders. It is that capital which is contributed by shareholders. It is that capital. Now we are talking about borrowed capital. It is that capital which is borrowed from, creditors, It is also known as debt capital. Next point, that is sources. In that, the capital is collected by collected by the issue of equity shares, the issue of equity shares and preference shares, equity shares and preference shares, and lugging back of profit, lugging back of profit, that is ownership securities, at borrowed capital. It is collected by way of the issue of debentures, fixed deposits, loans from financial institutions, etc. That is loans, borrowings. Next point, that is return on investment. Return on investment. Return on investments. Return on investment. The shareholders get dividends. The shareholders get dividends as income on their investment, as income on their investment. The rate of dividend is fluctuating. The rate of dividend is fluctuating. The rate of dividend is fluctuating in the case of equity shares. In the case of equity shares, but it is fixed in the case of preference shares. But it is fixed in case of preference shares. Coming back to borrowed capital, the debt capital holders get interested as income on their investment, Interest is paid at a fixed rate. The interest is paid at fixed rate. It is paid at fixed rate. Let us move on to the next point, which is status. In that, the shareholders are the owners of the company. The shareholders are the owners of the company. The shareholders are the owners of the company. To borrowed capital, the debt holders are creditors of the company. The debt holders are creditors of the company. Creditors of the company. Moving to the next point, that is voting rights. Voting rights. In that, the equity shareholders enjoy the equity shareholders enjoy normal voting rights at general meeting. At the general meetings. The creditors do not enjoy. In borrowed capital, the creditors do not enjoy. The creditors do not enjoy rights at the general meeting. General meeting. Next point, repayment of capital redemption. Repayment of capital redemption. In that, the shareholders do not enjoy the shareholders do not enjoy priority over creditors. Priority over creditors. They are eligible for repayment of capital only after making payment to payment to creditors at the time of winding up of the company. Winding up of the company. In borrowed capital, the creditors get priority over the shareholders. over the shareholders in case of return of principal amount, return of principal amount in case of return of principal amount at the time of winding up of the company. Winding up of the company. Next point, that is charge on assets. Charge on assets. The shareholders do not have any charge on the assets of the company, on the assets of the company. In borrowed capital, the secured debenture holder have a charge on the assets of the company. Have a charge on the assets of the company. So this was your distinguish between, we saw owned capital and borrowed capital. Before that, shares and debentures, and also equity shares and preference shares. I hope you would understand the distinguish between these points. Thank you.